Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you, Valeria. This was definitely a lot of information. And I think everybody's sort of thinking that. So just to let you know before we start the Q&A, that we will be circulating a sort of a briefing poster type thing that summarizes what we've talked about today. And that also brings in some of your answers to the polls and some of your answers to the Mentimeter earlier. We can bring up the Mentimeter up in a minute, but before we do so, I want to make sure that we answer the questions that came in quite early on. So there's a question in the chat from Sarah, who is asking, and also asking, sometimes I worry that guys are not always tempted to intervene or may have it harder to do so because, for example, the victim-friendly male, let's call him the speak-up man, may be dismissed in his attempts to speak up because he is white and the offender is not. So there's the racism card in there. Or when the offender is a well-known teacher, but the man who is speaking up is a student. So how to break the perceived bro code? Before I hand over to you, Tim, Sarah, I would highly recommend a podcast called Remaking Manhood with Jackson Katz. It has been shared in our Safer Down Spaces Facebook page. It is very, very, very good, and it touches on this very particularly so. And one of the things that they say is how nowadays society celebrates following actually much more than it celebrates leading, because leadings would mean to actually step out of the following and jump off the bandwagon in these sort of cases. But Tim, do you want to take your views on that?
There's a lot to unpack when it comes to the, and I don't think I'm going to defeat the bro code in one shot, but two things, and one's short and one's a bit longer. The first thing is I go back to look at who's here today, right? I'm a white male, so cis hetero white male, obviously, but I'm here in a partnership, right? You don't have to do this alone. So when we think about how do we address this, build those communities in partnership so that it is terrifying for any individual to put themselves out there. And there's different levels, and we can talk about different perceived privileges and powers. But at the end of the day, in any social group, someone is taking a risk going it alone. Being in partnerships and group is good. And I think having men be part of the participate in that discussion is vital, because we can speak to one another abruptly and bluntly and say, hey, that's not right. That's not cool. There is no bro code that justifies abuse. You can't go to any historical document and find abusive behavior as being, we sort of lend these things a sort of bro code, but it's really for sort of a code for anxiety. Also, men are the victims too. And this is a part where I think we need to highlight, and this may little extended rant I go on, but 40 years ago, we didn't think rape in a marriage arrangement was something that happened. 30 years ago, we didn't think sexual assault at the workplace was something that happened. 20 years ago, we didn't think these highly credible churches and universities were systemically preying on people. 10 years ago, we didn't think about the pervasive nature of these systemic predators exposed in the Me Too universe that are 100. What are we going to know 10 years from now? What are you going to know 20 years from now? I am telling you right now that the knowledge of men being victims, both of men and of other women and non-binaries, this whole thing, it's lagging. Reporting always lags the incident. So, I'm not saying do this because you're protecting yourself. Do it because you're protecting your community. It may not be you who suffers from this, but it may be someone in the future. And making an open space, it's the tide that lifts all boats, right? Community safety is not something that's only going to help women or only going to help gays or only going to help this. It helps everyone. So I think addressing that head on, forming in a team and addressing it that way is how I would sort of approach that question.
Thank you, Tim. And actually, the podcast I mentioned talks about what you just mentioned about calling people out, but also the way to do it. And I think it calls it compassionate confrontation. So it is because I care about you as a person, because you are my bro, that I need to tell you that that type of thing is not okay. We have another question from Sevda saying, how can we change people's perception when you warn them about a particular individual and their behavior, and then the response is that, oh, you're saying these things because you're jealous or whatever, and somebody added to that saying, or otherwise you have somebody responding saying, oh, you're making a big deal out of nothing, stop exaggerating, the typical gaslighting stuff. And all of these examples, by the way, that you give us here are examples that are very telling of rape culture. And these are examples that we go through actually in our induction training for SDS. When you hear these things, that means that you are operating in rape culture. And this is what Tim was saying earlier, that the main thing that we are, the best thing that we could do would be to tweak. I'm not going to say change because change is big, but to tweak the culture itself slowly into something that is more inclusive and safer. But Tim, do you have views on that?
Sure. So real brief, what's going on neurologically when people react this way? Let's start with the brain. When we study things like terrorism and catastrophic incidents and catastrophic failures, we consistently see there were warning signs that were missed. And there's a good body of literature that says, if your brain hears something that forces it to confront something it doesn't want to think about, you have about 30 seconds to 2 minutes to take it seriously. Otherwise, your brain's going to give you a rationalization to not take it seriously. And I can give a personal example. I had a pickup. I had a pressure washer. I put the pressure washer in the back of the pickup. I said, hey, should I tie that down? Should I secure it? I got distracted. 30 seconds later, I said, nah, it should be fine. First red light, it comes right through the back window of the truck. Right? Simple example. But this kind of mental reaction is what is happening when people are reacting in that way. They don't want to confront that their friend of 20 years or the most popular person in their group or the star that brings all the business in might be a predator. So there's two ways I talk to them about. One is, if you are presenting this to someone who hasn't had this thing, list the behaviors first. Don't put a name to it. Remember, the brain is rationalizing. And once I assign a name, my brain goes, oh, they're high cachet, they're high celebrity. I said, listen, if I told you someone was doing these 5 things, what would be your reaction? That's unbelievable. We'll get on it. Well, then, okay, here's the person who's doing it. You've already sort of shortcut. The other thing is to systemically train people that when they hear a complaint, there's the phrase out there, believe all complaints. My thing is to say, spend that time with your brain, believing as if it were real and checking into it. Don't let your brain. So when I talk to men a lot too, I'm like, don't immediately let that rationalization. Like I said, even if a friend comes before me on a complaint, I have to disconnect my friendship for that 2 minutes just to make sure I'm giving it a serious reading. And I find that usually in that 2 minutes, if I can fight back that impulse to suppress it, I can begin to see it as real. And now I go looking and I find factors and I'm like, okay, this is a real problem. I need to step up about this. I can't just let myself rationalize a problem. I have to do something about that. So that's the two approaches. One of approach them with the elements of the behavior and get them to agree that that's wrong before bringing in the person. The second is train everyone not to dismiss or rationalize in the first 30 seconds to 2 minutes, which works in safety too. It's something that you'll see all the time in safety.
Thank you, Tim. I don't know, Valeria, if you had anything to add to this.
I'm in agreement with Tim, and that's one of the things I brought up about the problems with whisper networks is the behavior is saying where you warn an individual is an issue. The other thing that helps is when you have reporting systems in place. And although this can be controversial as well, one of the other things that helps with an effective reporting system is documentation. Because if you have a problem and they're also, and this is pretty consistently a pattern I see, a source of social conflict is used as a digression. You will hear, you're jealous, it's a bad breakup, you're being unreasonable, you're discriminating against this person, they can't help it if they come across as kind of creepy, you're a prude, you're unreasonable about this thing. All these things become derails, and a combination between documenting what's actually happening, because even if you don't get this person next time, remember how Tim said these become patterns? It becomes harder and harder and harder if you document and deal with it. Another thing, like Tim said, you can't do everything about people's emotional reactions, but what have I found effective in communities where I've had a volunteering role is flipping the conversation to talk about the impacts of what happens if we don't address this. For example, a common thing that comes up is, well, how can we know for sure this happened? And one thing that I found is an effective wedge to get people to take it seriously is to point out how when you're choosing not to do anything, you're still making a choice. And that's a thing that a lot of groups have a hard time understanding. They tend to believe if I don't do anything, then I'm not taking a side. Whereas if you can convince them that by not taking a side, they are effectively choosing to maintain the presence of the missing stairs, you can make them understand that, for example, You have someone who is a serial abuser that the community is more or less aware of. So your community is selecting for people who either tolerate the behavior and put it to be personal responsibility, or otherwise don't feel this can be solved. If you want to change it, not focusing on my friendship with Dan, but rather all the other people in the community who are either going to be pushed out or affected by that, can also be very helpful for reframing the argument. And this one is particularly useful when you've got someone who's got a position of power where they have the ability to ban someone, but they're paralyzed by, I can't know what happened in that hotel room. I can't know if he actually wanted, from the example in the chat, her to grind on him. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Is it really my place? Really, I have to accept you have a bias here, because you did end up getting into an argument with them last month about the fact they were grinding on someone else. I'm not going to say it's not hard. I'm not going to say that even being an activist isn't like with its own risks, but that goes back to our original question of form partnerships with other people. If it is just you, you will get mowed over. Find organizations like Safer Dance Spaces, talk to them, get their support. You are as much a social person as the person who's like, oh, we need to protect the group. Again, to my final point on that, reframe the argument in terms of what you're doing is to protect the group. You are not particularly concerned whether this member deserves to be punished and to fall in a hole and have bad things happen to them. You just don't want to ever see this happen to anyone else.
Thank you, Valeria. And I guess I think the key takeaway is doing nothing is already choosing to do, making a choice to do nothing, which is key, rather than, because, you know, once you've been aware of something, whatever you do next is a choice. We have another question from Sarah saying, at some events, there are women actively recruiting other women to join private parties in the room of their dancer friend. And this is giving the potential victim a cool, I belong to a team-like feeling. So this feeling of belonging, etc. But it's actually quite a hard situation to get out from, because once you enter the, you know, the room from your own consenting mind, not necessarily knowing all that was going to happen in the room. She's mentioning orgy type situations. New students or dancers may experience this at certain festivals. And do you have any advice on holding these people who are recruiting people into private parties accountable? Because obviously they would justify their behavior as saying, well, I got you into the party, but I did not make you stay, nor did I force you to do anything in there. What's your reactions to this? I guess Tim first.
I'll start off and then hand it over to Valeria. I think when we see in these investigations, there could be entire sessions about how to investigate these things. But what Valeria said about documentation is key. These patterns are repetitive, they are habituated, and they are repeated. So a one-off of this person recruited me and I got in this situation is a data point. The second time it happens, that's pretty serious. The third time, who are we kidding, right? So I think documenting these patterns of behavior, and the challenge is abusers can exist in any group or entity, men, women, gay, lesbian, bisexual. They may be more at risk of being abused themselves, but they can also exist in those communities. And don't think anyone is sort of off limits. Take all accusations seriously, but then also understand to divorce empathy from a bad situation, from the need and that obligation to act ethically on a complaint. And what I mean by that is a lot of times people who are enablers of abusers are themselves being abused or may come from an abusive relationship. And that is the terrible cyclical nature of abuse, is this doesn't usually start as a one-off greenfield just showed up. But even so, you can be empathetic to say, we can't let you continue doing this because you're harming others or putting them in a situation that is harmful. You know, telling someone to go down those stairs and not telling them about the broken stair or not fixing the broken stair, you are enabling injury when someone gets hurt. So I want to leave time for Valeria to respond to this, but that would be the way I'd approach. Document and get the repetition of behaviors, and then separate empathy from a personal situation with accountability for the harm they may have enabled or caused.
Yeah, to Tim's point, what you have is systems within systems, and that the women involved who are serving as recruitment, my experience observing this pattern, and you're very correct, much like how communities can unconsciously end up pulling people in, people can similarly end up creating these micro bubbles where, for example, the really toxic polycule you have a couple of individuals who are absolutely fantastic in this polycule, and then you have that one person in this polycule with the personality and behavior of cat piss. Pardon my language, I think we've all seen that. Or it's very much a replication of the same dynamic. And one of the things that's helpful here is, and again, this is why I took the bold step of including the link to Pervocracy's blog. You see a lot of overlap between creative communities like dance and really sexually progressive communities where non-monogamy or other alternative sexual practices are used, including public partner sharing in these closed loops. So the first thing you can do is have a little bit of an awareness of what's going on, because that also makes it much easier for you to deal with the space if you understand some of the norms, because it makes it harder for the people involved who are a problem to derail it to, you're attacking our community. It's not an issue so much that there are orgies happening, although that goes back to Tim's point about sexualized environments provide more risk. The problem is how these orgies are going to be happening. And from an event organizer perspective, and I'm sorry that, again, a lot of these questions involve the individual, and the answer of the individual is, that sucks. It's really hard to go at as an individual. But from a larger organizational perspective, you have to take an honest approach. And for example, in the case of alcohol, okay, you want to have alcohol at your events, even though it's a risk factor? Well, here are the safety factors we know. You're going to need to have sober staff whose job it is to mind people and stuff. You want to use this festival as an excuse to hold your mini hotel orgy parties? That's great. What safety factors are you doing to allow for what happens when you have an orgy? And again, when I'm talking about adult communities have safety practices in place. For example, again, using the example of BDSM, where some people enjoy going to group parties where they'll do activities, usually just be with their partners, but it'll be in a more community space. And these communities have a policy of having volunteers who tour the room and make sure nothing untoward is happening that no one didn't consent to. And when you're having a private orgy, that person is having a high risk activity, and they may love the orgy and the orgy is wonderful, but your problem isn't just that your women are grooming and bringing in new volunteer members who don't know that there's a horrible person who's going to pressure you and make it impossible for you to leave once you get into that room, or who aren't warning you. Oh, by the way, if you go into the hotel where the cool party is happening, when you hit about 2 a.m., everyone suddenly loses their trousers. We're just going to expect you to be cool with that. You need to have an environment which paradoxically is more honest about what you're doing and recognizes it as a risk factor without necessarily being judgmental. Similar to Tim's point that companies can ban office romances, community groups, dating is just par for the course. If you take an attitude of completely refusing to acknowledge these are happening and being like, that's not what the dance space is for, no one is doing this, you are ignoring the role. And if you ignore that dance spaces overlap with people with alternative sexualities and practices, you are participating in that risk. So you can't necessarily target the women, except for, as Tim pointed out, my experience is that if you wait a couple of years, one of these women are going to end up mowed over by these problem groups. She's going to end up on the outs because she's going to hit her limit. The leopards are going to eat her face too, and she's going to end up being the ostracized person. That's just how these things work. But also getting event organizers to acknowledge orgy parties are just part of what adults are going to do. It's weird if you're not into it. It's wonderful if you are. No judgment, but you need to accommodate around those, much like you would handle any sort of other expectation that these groups do. And you have to extend the boundaries of what your community is willing to police into the orgy because they're recruiting from within your dance circle or your festival.
That goes back to that dance space versus non-dance space, confronting what happens in the non-dance space, but it's there because of the dance community. That's where we often talk to a lot of groups of like, yeah, you aren't necessarily setting these up, but they're not at the hotel by accident. They didn't plan their travel and buy airline tickets by accident, just randomly got there. They got there because they're part of this community, and you have to accept that responsibility as a community, which gets tricky because people want to say, well, I only want to do dance. But what are some more questions, Laura?
So I think what I'm going to do now is actually open the anonymous questions, because we have probably time for 2 or maybe 3 more questions, and we have a couple of people who have asked that. So the way to do this is to use the same link that you were using earlier for Menti, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the next question. Actually, let me start by sharing.